But right now, John Fraser, NRA ILA's Research and Information Division Director, is with us. John, good evening, sir.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
I'm good. Do you have power tonight?
I do.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Sorry about last night. I'm glad that you're okay and you made it home safe and sound.
Yeah, well, I was home, but the problem is I was sitting home in the dark with no working phone.
Oh, well, I'm glad that you're with us tonight because there's a lot of stuff to get to. Let's start with this New York Times story that seems to assert that the NRA hates science. John, yeah. What's going on here?
Yeah.
Is the NRA opposed to science?
No, not at all, not at all. And in fact, we have never stood in the way of legitimate research on firearms issues. Our concern back in the 90s, in the period this Times article talks about, is that there were a lot of studies out there that were not legitimate science. They were junk science by any stretch of the imagination. They were studies being created to essentially discourage gun ownership by trying to persuade people that that guns are more dangerous to their owners than to criminals. And these were studies you've heard all of these ratios. 3 times more likely, 3 times more dangerous.
Yeah.
43 times more likely to kill a family member, or that kind of thing. You never hear the fine print of these studies, which is things like that the person was not murdered with his own gun, that these were usually single city studies of cities that aren't typical of anywhere else in the country,
mm-hmm.
And so forth.
Yeah, and so this is what the NRA does not want to see is this. Can we call it junk science?
Yep.
Masquerading as legitimate research or inquiries, and that's what you. I don't think anybody would want to see federal funding go towards that.
No, and we took some legislative steps with our allies in Congress to reduce the funding and impose and put a restriction on, which says that the CDC can't use injury prevention money to advocate or promote gun control. A provision which they have interpreted very narrowly, by the way. They have funded other studies since then.
Mm-hmm.
Other government agencies have funded studies, and certainly private foundations have stepped in as well. So it's not as if there is no shortage of funding it's not as if there is a shortage of funding for anti-gun researchers, because they keep on cranking out the work.
Which is something, again, the New York Times really wasn't all that interested in covering. Apparently, no. It must be done by the government, or else it's just not legitimate.
Not only by the government, but by this particular agency.
Yeah.
And I think the New York Times article does go to show that the NRA is an effective organization when it comes to making our views heard. I think the other thing, though, I have to give this writer credit, because he wrote a companion article the same day, maybe the previous day, which illustrated exactly why we did what we did, and that was an article where he talked about how correlation in the context of gun control research, the difficulty of sorting out correlation and causation. In other words, are two figures or two factual phenomena that you find in a study, does one cause the other, or is it just a coincidence that they're associated? And it's very hard to sort out. And this is the failure to even try to sort these out is the key flaw of a lot of the studies that we didn't want to see repeated. So, for example, studies that say that you are more likely to be murdered if you own a gun. Well, they rarely tell you whether the people might have owned a gun because of some aspect of their lives that made them more likely to be murdered.
Yeah.
There's a workplace violence study that's along these lines, which suggests that having an anti-gun policy in the workplace is associated with reduced danger to employees. Well, the same study also showed that having surveillance cameras is associated with a higher risk. I mean, but everyone knows the surveillance having surveillance cameras in a convenience store doesn't cause robberies. You have the surveillance cameras because convenience stores get robbed.
Oh, geez.
So so that kind of a thing, I think, to his credit, this New York Times reporter brought out is a constant problem in these gun studies. And even some of the anti-gun researchers that he talked to admit that.
Well, good for the reporter for at least bringing that up. Now, the other thing that the other story I wanted to bring up is down in Florida, there's a piece of legislation that would make it a felony for doctors to inquire, do you own a gun? How many guns do you have? Where do you store your firearms? Have you talked to your kids about guns? Couldn't bring it up in the context of talking to a patient. And Marion Hammer wrote a rebuttal to a letter to the editor, I guess, and in it she brought up the fact that there are far more people who die because of medical mistakes than because of accidents involving firearms. The group Polyfact took a look at this, and I thought it was really interesting, John. They determined that Marion Hammer was right, and yet at the end of the day they said, well, her claims were only mostly true.
Right.
I mean, they couldn't even say, yeah, she got it right. I mean, it's amazing how little credit. I guess I shouldn't be surprised at how little credit supposedly unbiased reporters are willing to give the National Rifle Association and gun owners, but it still amazes me.
Yeah. Well, and this is actually, the story is a very interesting parallel to the New York Times story, in that the kind of research that we took issue with back in the 90s in the CDC legislative battle were studies that, whenever they came out, immediately got massive front page attention, very uncritical. No one ever delved into whether they were accurate or reliable until long after the front page coverage had faded.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but what we see here is that the NRA helps produce a fact sheet that repeats government data on gun safety, and PolitiFact picks it apart, and the NRA ILA's research coordinator, Mark Overstreet, had to spend a significant chunk of time over about 5 days, going back and forth with this reporter to explain how we compiled the data, which was basically just downloading it from government websites.
Really? It took 5 days to explain that?
It was a complicated process, and in fairness to the PolitiFact people, and there is this profusion of organizations like FactCheck.org and PolitiFact and so on, which exist to delve into these things. There is a lot of information out there that the government compiles, and they change classifications and headings under which they list different types of incidents and so on. But ultimately they had to conclude that we were right, and in fact the article pointed out that we were being conservative.
Yeah.
If anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are much higher estimates of how many people die due to mishaps at the hands of doctors. But we went with what the government does. We go to a lot of trouble to get these things right. And it was nice to get some credit for it once. Now they rated it as mostly true, and that's only because because it's something we weren't trying to do, which is we weren't trying to reflect every aspect of fatality involving guns. We were only trying to cover accidents, which is an apples-to-apples fair comparison here.
Right. Well, yeah, and so you get dinged for that, I guess.
Right. So I'm not sure it's mostly true if you're telling the whole truth about what you were trying to talk about. But
I'm trying to. It's the new math, I guess, John. Now listen. I don't know. Have you had a chance to look over this ATF ruling that came out this afternoon?
Only very, very quickly. You're referring to the shotgun study?
Yeah. Okay, so with the caveat that you haven't looked at it, basically what does this say?
Well, basically, it's another instance of ATF using the sporting purposes test for firearms importation as a way to restrict importation of certain firearms. In this case, it's shotguns, which they haven't previously evaluated in great detail in this manner before.
Okay.
Now the problem, of course, is the sporting purposes test may well be at odds with the Constitution, since the Supreme Court has now made clear that the primary purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect guns for defensive purposes, not sporting purposes, and that may well include the ability to import them. But that may be for the courts to decide at a later date.
Okay. Now, I've seen some discussion from some of the gun blogs that the definition of sporting purposes was kind of investigated, and the ATF says, well, we basically need another study to determine whether things like IDPA and IPSC would fall under sporting purposes.
Well, that's interesting because in the previous import bans in '89 and '98 on rifles, or primarily on rifles in '89 and entirely on rifles in '98, they basically discounted the idea that practical type competition was a sport at all. They said this is combat training essentially. This is not a sport. But with the increasing popularity of sports like this, IPSC, USPSA in this country, IDPA, cowboy action shooting, and so forth, they may well be forced to recognize at some point that increasingly these are generally recognized as sporting purposes.
All right. Well, listen, John, I'm glad you could join us on the program tonight, sir. I really appreciate your time, and I'm glad that you are well lit and warm this evening.
Thank you very much, Cam. It's much better than the alternative.
Thank you, John. Look forward to talking again soon.